What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. It's your favorite uncle, Chris D, aka Willy Wonka, aka Doobie Man, back in the motherfucking house, back with another stream of consciousness. And what I want to talk about in this particular stream of consciousness is, why do Dominicans say, I know black, and do they hate Black Americans? A little background to begin. I've lived in Santo Domingo since 2013 with like 1.5 years back in the States before coming back to Santo Domingo. So I have more than 12, 13 years experience living in the country surrounded by the locals. My perspective is unique in that sense. In addition to my own perspective, I got virtual Chris on the podcast as well to offer additional insight and to back up anything I say with facts. So let's break this down into 5 parts. This being part 1, and each part I will address a different aspect of the question, why do Dominicans say I know black? Point 1, their culture is different from ours. Negroes, black, African Americans, or FBAs if you prefer, are the people in America that were transported there initially via slavery and whose ancestors laid the foundation for what would become America. These are facts. These people have survived the trip to America, the beatings, multiple wars, and random acts of violence that followed them since they got off them boats. Their relationship to their oppressors was of deep sorrow, frustration, anger, and also fear, love, and many other very, very complex emotions. Sometimes the owners would separate them by how light their skin tone was, or by how much information they were given about the quote-unquote bad ones, or the ones who wanted to be free. So within that, created a caste system of Uncle Toms, dark-skinned slaves looking to improve their own position by whatever means necessary, or light-skinned house slaves that found that if they mimicked the masters, wore their clothes, spoke as they spoke, and copied their mannerisms, that they would be accepted somewhat. Still lower class than the masters, but above the other slaves. Now compare that to Dominican Republic and how the slave trade worked there. A different operating system, which means that the stuff in their DNA that they get carried down is much different as far as what was passed down than what was happening in the States. To give some context, I'm bringing in virtual Chris to speak on what the system was like in the Dominican Republic during that time and the slavery system from Spain versus what America had. All right, so Chris, speak to the people.
Absolutely. For the sake of the podcast, I'll stick to what historians generally agree on and separate established facts from interpretation. Point 1, different historical experiences created different racial identities. When people in the United States think about race, they're usually thinking through a framework shaped by British colonialism, slavery in the American South, segregation, and the later development of a Black American identity. The Dominican Republic developed under a different colonial system, different demographics, and different social categories. First, it's important to understand that slavery existed in both places, but it operated differently. In what is now the United States, particularly in the English colonies and later the American South, slavery evolved into a rigid racial caste system. By the 1700s and 1800s, laws increasingly defined people as either white or black, and even a small amount of African ancestry could legally place someone into the black category. Historians often refer to this as the development of the one-drop rule, although its application varied by state and period. In the Spanish colonies, including Santo Domingo, society developed differently. Spain established a caste system that recognized numerous racial categories such as Español, Mestizo, Mulatto, Moreno, and others. While racism and slavery absolutely existed, the social structure allowed for more racial mixing and more intermediate identities than the binary system that developed in the United States. By the late colonial period, Santo Domingo had a population that included Europeans, Africans, mixed race people, and free people of color. In fact, free people of African descent represented a much larger portion of the population than in many British colonies. Another major difference is demographics. The Dominican Republic today is a heavily mixed society. Genetic studies consistently show that most Dominicans possess varying combinations of European, African, and indigenous Taino ancestry. The exact proportions vary by region and family, but the average Dominican is neither exclusively European nor exclusively African. As a result, many Dominicans historically identified themselves by nationality first. Soy Dominicano. Not I'm black. Not I'm white. But I'm Dominican. That doesn't mean African ancestry is absent. It means nationality became the primary identity marker. Now here's where Americans often misunderstand the conversation. When an American hears a Dominican say, I'm not black, the American often interprets it as, I don't like black people. But many Dominicans mean, I'm Dominican, not African American. Those are two very different statements. That doesn't mean colorism and anti-black attitudes don't exist in Dominican society. They do, just as they exist throughout Latin America and many parts of the world. But reducing every Dominican who rejects the label black to simple self-hatred or anti-blackness ignores the historical reality that Dominicans inherited a completely different racial vocabulary. A Dominican man who would be considered unquestionably black in Atlanta, Chicago, or Houston may describe himself as Indio, Moreno, or simply Dominicano, because those are categories that developed within Dominican society. So the first thing listeners need to understand is this. The average Dominican did not inherit the same racial operating system as the average African American. African Americans largely inherited a binary racial system shaped by English colonialism and Jim Crow. Dominicans inherited a more fluid racial system shaped by Spanish colonialism, centuries of racial mixing, Dominican nationalism, and the country's unique history on the island of Hispaniola. If you start the conversation from that foundation, a lot of what people interpret as hostility begins to make more sense historically, even if you don't agree with it. And that's point one. Before asking why Dominicans say, I know black, you have to understand that Dominicans and Black Americans were taught two very different definitions of what the word black means.
Right. African Americans that live in the U.S., whether they realize it or not, are also operating within the same system that they're trying to fight against. It's insidious. It's deep. It cuts to the core of our identity and what makes us us.